Today I'm going to show you how I made this DIY plywood coffee table with patterned plywood panels that reveal hidden storage. By the way, I'm Erin Spain. Welcome to my channel. Please be sure to subscribe if you haven't already and click the bell icon. Okay, so there was a lot of trial and error with this project when it came to creating the patterned plywood. So I'm going to walk you through the entire process and what I learned, and hopefully I made all the mistakes so you won't have to. I'll be sure to link to everything I used in the description box below, and I will also link to the written tutorial on my website. If you have any questions, please leave those for me in the comment section below, and let's get started. I started with a large scrap of 3/4 inch maple plywood that I had left over from another project. I was trying to only use materials that I had on hand for this project, but you can buy a 4-foot by 8-foot sheet of this plywood at Home Depot. First, I used my handheld circular saw to cut my plywood to size. I cut 2 pieces at 35 inches by 18 inches for the top and bottom, but you can modify this to be any size you choose. I clamped a board down to use as a straight edge to guide my saw, and I had to trim the edges too since the piece wasn't square to begin with. I clamped the top and bottom together to make sure they would be the exact same size and also to save time. Next, I cut 4 pieces at 18 inches by 3 3/4 inches for the sides and the 2 cubby partitions. I actually ended up cutting them a little bit too wide and then shortening them later, which I'll show you in a minute, but the final dimensions ended up being 18 inches by 3 3/4 inches. I sanded everything with my orbital sander. I used my pocket hole jig to drill pocket holes along one side of each of my 18 by 3 3/4 inch pieces. I wanted to attach these pieces to the top of the coffee table from underneath without being able to see screws from the top side. I made sure the collar on my pocket hole drill bit was set to work with 3/4 inch thick material, and I adjusted my pocket hole jig accordingly as well. I drilled 4 holes in each piece, and when I attach the bottom of the table, I can just drill that from underneath using regular construction screws, which is why I only drilled pocket holes along one side. I swapped out my pocket hole drill bit with the driver bit that came with my jig, and then I used 1 1/4 inch long pocket screws to attach these pieces to what will later be the top of the coffee table. I have it flipped over right now, and I'm currently working upside down. I attached the side pieces for now, and I'll wait to add the partitions until I know exactly how wide my patterned plywood panels are going to be, because those will be going in the center. Okay, now here's where things went a little bit wrong and I wasted a lot of time. I wanted the pattern panels to be fairly thin, as they will be attached with magnets and reveal hidden storage in the center of the front and back side of the coffee table. So there would be 2 panels, 1 for each side. I decided to cut the plywood strips at 1/4 inch thick, which just ended up being way too thin and flimsy once I glued them up, so don't do this. I also had the dilemma of not owning large enough bar clamps for the glue up, so I made do with what I had, and I also rigged my own somewhat ineffective clamps for this, and it didn't work well. I later decided to do 2 smaller glue ups instead of 1 big one, and I ended up cutting 1 inch thick strips instead, which worked much better. So let's skip to that part. By the way, if you want a legitimate resource for making patterned plywood, check out Michael Alm from Alm Fab. I'll link to his channel in the description box. I had fun experimenting and learning, but he actually knows what he's doing. By the way, if you have a table saw, this part will be much quicker and easier and more precise, but I wanted to try it with the limited tools that I have. It's definitely possible to do it this way, it's just a bit more time consuming. You could also use a straight edge, but lining it up and clamping was just going to take more time, and I had to cut so many of these that I decided to just eyeball it, which is actually much easier to do when you're working on the ground, and you can look straight down at the line you're following. I cut as many 1 inch strips as I could with the scrap plywood I had left, and if I'd had more plywood I probably would have made the panels longer in the end, but I'm just working with what I have. But you can certainly modify this however you choose. I sanded all the rough edges with my orbital sander, and you'll have less tear out if you apply painter's tape to the surface before you cut, but again, I was a little lazy and didn't want to spend all that extra time. Next, I laid all of the plywood strips down flat and applied wood glue. I like to use a silicone brush to spread the glue evenly, and then I glued the pieces together with the end grain facing up. I staggered the strips for the glue up because I'm going to be cutting it at a 45-degree angle, so this created less waste. I made sure they were lined up with enough space for me to cut the end at 45 degrees using my square as a guide, and then clamped them together. I did this twice, creating 2 separate sections to glue up since my clamps aren't very large, so I just repeated that whole process 1 more time. After the glue had dried, I removed the clamps and sanded everything smooth with my orbital sander. Then I marked a 45-degree line along the top edge of each panel. I set my miter saw to a 45-degree angle so that I would be cutting the strips at a 45-degree angle parallel to each other. I marked 2 inches in from the side edge and cut as many 2-inch wide strips as I could. I laid them down and flipped every other one around so the angles would alternate, creating a chevron pattern. Then I glued them together. It wasn't perfectly smooth, but I decided I could sand or plane it later, so I didn't worry about that just yet. By the time I had cut the excess off this time, I just had one small panel to glue up. So I glued and clamped it and left it to dry overnight. The next day I removed the clamps and, okay, here's where I should have stopped myself because I decided to use my handheld planer to smooth it out and I just went to town and botched it. I didn't realize I was creating a bit of a slope, so the thickness ended up being uneven. I later decided to throw together a quick DIY sled for my router to smooth it out instead, which I'll show you in a minute. The planer itself is great, this was just me being careless and doing a bad job. After I botched it with the planer, I gave it a good sanding with my orbital sander. Now if you want a chevron pattern, you can stop here, but I wanted a diamond-shaped pattern, so I cut 2-inch thick strips with my miter saw. This time I set the miter saw back to 0 and I did not cut it at a 45-degree angle. By the way, see how sloped that is? We will address that later. I flipped every other strip around like I did earlier, creating a diamond pattern, and glued it up one more time. Because of my terrible job planing, the surface was completely uneven, but I decided I would address that after the glue up. I also chipped one of the corners while I was planing, so I was going to have to trim that edge off. Again, so much trial and error happening here. After the glue had dried, I trimmed the edge with the chipped corner off and then cut the remaining panel in half, creating 2 rectangular panels. I used painter's tape to minimize tear out when cutting. Okay, here's where I put together a quick router sled, which basically just allows you to cut at an even depth across the entire surface of your wood, which makes it smooth. I needed a bit extender for this to work well, so unfortunately my panels are still uneven, but when the table is assembled you can't tell. And I can always fix them later. I'll add links in the description to some helpful router sled tutorials that I found, but my advice to you is to find a method that works best for you to plane the panels smooth, whether you sand them, use a router, or a planer. The sides of my panels weren't square, so I needed to trim them a bit. I measured and marked so I could make sure that when I trimmed the sides, the diamond pattern would still be centered. In the end, they ended up being 8.5 inches long and 3 3/4 inches wide. I cut 2 pieces of plywood at 18 inches by 3 3/4 inches for the cubby partitions and trimmed the side pieces I cut earlier to the same height and then reattached them. I drilled pocket holes along one side of each of the cubby partition pieces just like I did to the sides earlier. Next, I measured and marked the center of each pattern panel and measured and marked the center of each side of the coffee table. Then I lined up the center point of the little panel with the center point of the table so I would know exactly where to place the cubby partition pieces. I made sure to keep it square and even and then attached the partition pieces on either side of the patterned panels using 1 1/4 inch pocket screws. I wanted to attach the panels with magnets like I did for my son's desk, which I will link in the description, but I didn't have the same kind of magnet, so I used these magnetic touch latches instead. I centered the little metal plate at the top of my panel, well it will be the top when we flip everything over, and I attached the touch latch to the center of the table, making sure to line it up so the panel is flush with the edge when the latch is pushed in. I marked and drilled a few pilot holes, then screwed the latch on, and then I just repeated the same process on the other side. Next, I placed my other large plywood panel on top, this will be the bottom when we flip it, and I used a countersinking drill bit to pre-drill holes along either side and along where the partitions are. Then I used 1.5 inch construction screws to attach it. I applied 2 coats of Minwax polyacrylic satin top coat. After it dried, I flipped it over and attached the legs. I received these hairpin legs from a company called DIY Hairpin Legs, and I will link to them in the description box along with the specifications of the legs that I used. I spaced them 1 inch away from each edge, pre-drilled pilot holes, and screwed them on. I did end up having to use shorter screws than the ones they came with since I'm working with thinner material. And that's it. Now for the outtakes. everyone, no. All right, you want this on? Okay, here. What is that? Jeez. Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how I made this DIY patterned, no, stupid bug. Oh, jeez. My channel. Please be sure to subscribe. Subscribe. It's not that difficult. Subscribe. Okay. Words are hard. Words. You through really, buddy. I'm trying to record. Oh my gosh. All right. Just open your string cheese. All right, dude. On your way. Thanks for watching. You can find me online at ErinSpain.com and on social media at ErinSpainBlog. Please be sure to check out some of my other videos. Thanks, everyone.